right, I'm here with Chris, and I've linked their channels in the description, so definitely check their channels out. And yeah, so it'll be a time debate, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. And I'll let Theist Thinker Chris go first because you're new guest to the channel. Go ahead and introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, so hello, I am Theist Thinker. Most of you probably know me from Twitter, but I kind of got my start making TikTok videos about philosophy of religion that have sort of branched into working on more comprehensive things on Twitter, and I'm looking to branch into YouTube sometime soon. But yeah, I'm super happy to be here. Obviously, a little bit of background about my philosophical beliefs. I am a theist, and more specifically, I'm a Roman Catholic. But yeah, greatly looking forward to this debate. Just want to give a quick thank you to Dry Apologist for hosting this, as well as John Buck for being my debate prep and kind of helper throughout the process, as well as Invoking Theism, who sent me some very helpful resources that I am looking forward to utilizing in this debate. So thank you.
All right, yeah, thanks for coming on. All right, Youth Resist, Chris.
Yeah, I'm Youth Resist, also known as Chris Rhodes, and I have a Twitter account at Youth Resist. I've been on here before. I've debunked theism numerous times on this channel. Most of you guys probably know me from Twitter, and I also have a blog and a YouTube channel that I run with two of my friends, JC and Gabe, also known as Little Apologist, and we're all young people interested in the philosophy of religion, and we also tackle other topics on that channel. And yeah, and so also laying out my general philosophical outlook, I am a atheist, more specifically a naturalist, and here I'm going to be arguing sort of different from what I've done before. I'm going to present a cumulative case for naturalism against theism, and I think that's sufficient for my introduction.
All right, thank you. Thanks for coming on. Okay, Theist Thinker, it's going to be a 15-minute opener. So let me add your slideshow. It looks like you need to re-add it, actually.
Okay, let me toss that in real quick. Okay, just want to make sure that everyone can see that?
Yes.
Okay,
right.
Fantastic.
Go ahead and start now.
Okay, so this is going to be my cumulative case for theism. Chris and I are both going to be doing a type of cumulative case where we kind of add up the evidence as a collection of different data points that support our positions, rather than a sort of deductive argument like certain contingency arguments or Kalam cosmological arguments. So up first, I'm just going to propose some basic definitions that Chris and I both agreed on before coming on here. So theism is the proposition that God exists, and God is any entity that is personal and conscious, as well as infinite in being. And if a being is infinite, it's going to entail certain properties like the triomny properties, as well as necessary existence. Naturalism, on the other hand, is Chris's position, and is the position that only natural things exist. No intent or consciousness is fundamental to reality, and no agency like that also entails a type of indifference to creatures and flourishing and suffering and that type of thing. So how do we want to kind of approach this? Well, with an evidential case, we're basically taking the two hypotheses, which are mutually exclusive, and in order to determine which one's likely to be true, we have to consider the theoretical costs and virtues of each hypothesis, such as simplicity, parsimony, explanatory scope, etc. And then evidence for the view. And in this case, evidence is that which is more expected under one hypothesis than another, thereby giving us reason to believe one is more probable than the other. So just discussing a little bit about the intrinsic probability of these hypotheses. So the first one I really want to bring up is simplicity, because I know that in discussions about theism and naturalism, simplicity gets brought up a lot. So I want to kind of talk about where I stand on that. So in terms of intrinsic probability, before the evidence is examined, for the sake of argument in this debate, I'm going to grant that naturalism is at least simpler than theism intrinsically, because it is only positing one type of entity. So it's qualitatively more simple. It's also quantitatively more simple since it's kind of cutting things off at natural explanations. The one thing I'm not going to explicitly grant at the start is ontological simplicity or parsimony. So the number of entities that are sort of going to be part of your fundamental explanation. I'll get into that a little bit more when we start on my first argument. But after that, we want to talk about explanatory scope, and I'm going to say that this is going to be the most important, and it's going to be sort of the simplicity and those other factors are going to be kind of taken into account once we determine the explanatory scope of these hypotheses. And keep in mind, I put TBD next to all of the simplicity categories because I believe that depending on how many explanations naturalism has to add to its hypothesis to explain data that theism already explains, it's going to add complexity to it. So evidence one, various considerations of contingency. So contingent beings are a data point which must be explained. And my definition of a contingent being is just any entity which exists but doesn't have to exist. And the only way to explain these types of contingent entities is with a necessary concrete being, right? If we appeal to another type of contingent being, then we still lack explanation as to why that specific contingent being exists. So I'm going to argue that the best explanation for contingent beings is going to be some type of necessary concrete being, which is able to bring about contingent beings. A theory which can't explain contingent beings loses explanatory power. So if you're going to posit brute facts, theism, which already has the explanation of a necessary being into it, is going to have a stronger hypothesis than anyone that accepts brute facts into its ontology. So again, theism already has a necessary being in its hypothesis, but basic naturalism that Chris describes does not. So in order to account for this data point, basic naturalism must become a more specific hypothesis, lowering its prior probability. Essentially, you're going to have to take Chris's hypothesis and then add on a necessary concrete entity, which brings about contingent entities. Further, naturalism must posit a new type of entity, a natural necessity. All natural objects we know of are contingent, and therefore positing a natural necessity goes against our background knowledge. Even further, a natural necessity, given the nature of natural entities, is going to be filled with additional necessities, such as its spatiotemporal extension, composition of physical parts, and other things like that. And so that's going to add on to the ontological complexity of the hypothesis. Because theism, at the foundation of the worldview of theism, they're just going to have one simple entity, whereas naturalism, if you're going to posit a necessary entity, you're going to have a natural explanation, but that's going to come with all of the additional ontological commitments that's going to come with having extension and physical parts, that type of thing. So now that I think we've gotten that out of the way, I want to talk about physical laws. And this is evidence that I think weighs the probability heavily in favor of theism. So physical reality follows descriptive physical laws. And these laws are repeatable and regular. And because of this, it helps to bring about greater goods. And these teleological facts, I want to argue, are highly expected under theism. Because God wants to bring about these really great goods like biological life and consciousness. And so it seems that we have really good reason to expect that if God exists and wants to create a universe, that universe is going to be extremely regular and in line with types of orderliness. But given naturalism, I believe it's unlikely that physical reality would behave in such an orderly way. It's in fact unlikely that there would be regular behavior of only one particle given an indifferent universe. That all these billions of particles that exist are regular is even more unlikely. Given the closed system of naturalism, there are many more ways for things to be irregular than regular. So just to kind of explain that a little bit more, think about just kind of like a universe with total indifference. Why should we expect the particle to behave in a uniform, regular way rather than a completely chaotic and random way, a completely disordered and completely disordered and chaotic universe? So I just think if we take that reverse scenario, such as the disordered universe, and consider if that was the case, wouldn't that constitute evidence for naturalism? If the universe was completely random and chaotic and just totally unpredictable, it seems like that's the type of thing we would expect given a universe that's totally indifferent. But because the counterance is true, facts about physical laws are evidence of theism over naturalism. Next up, life. Given theism, it's not at all surprising that an all-good God would want to create biological life to give rise to complex creatures, which can later give rise to conscious agents. Given naturalism, there's no entailment or expectation that biological life will occur. Naturalism's account of life requires a complex, mindless process to bring about life, completely indifferent to the outcome. Since there is life on our world, this counts as evidence towards theism. That life gives rise to consciousness, and it is evidence that there is at least one conscious agent in existence. Since, I perceive my own conscious experience, and everyone listening here probably experiences their own conscious experience. And theism actually entails consciousness. God is a conscious agent. There's no possible world that God actualizes in which at least one conscious agent does not exist. But on the countering theory, naturalism, there is a degree of possibility that consciousness would not exist because it's so late in the development of a long line of different processes. It seems very, very improbable that an indifferent universe would give rise to something so important and complex as consciousness. I also want to add that it's not at all surprising that God would want to create a conscious agent capable of thinking, experiencing, and reacting to the world around them. So that entailment of at least one conscious agent gives us really good reason to expect other conscious agents in existence. Next, morality. I think there's several key facts about morality that constitute evidence in favor of theism. First, morality requires moral agents capable of having rational thought about good and evil. In other words, you require the additional background knowledge of biological life and consciousness in order to even have moral agents. Furthermore, moral agents are actually an entailment of the theistic hypothesis as well, because God is a moral agent. So the fact that moral agents exist on theism is completely unsurprising, whereas it's at least not expected given naturalism. Furthermore, that type of rational thinking and that type of sitting through and considering values of good and evil just seems to be the type of thing we would expect on a universe where there's a God who really cares about the well-being of created beings. It also requires knowledge and access to moral truths. So I believe that there is a type of epistemological argument that can be made that theism just has a better account of moral knowledge than naturalism. On theism, the answer is just that creatures have moral knowledge because it is imparted to them by God. But on naturalism, it has to be a purely indifferent natural process of chance that gets us to moral knowledge. And I think the fact that, it's just coming across as a type of chance that we're getting moral knowledge under naturalism is significant evidence in favor of theism over naturalism. And finally, it requires moral truths. And again, moral truths are going to be an entailment of the theistic hypothesis, because if God exists and is all good, then God's nature is going to be the ultimate grounding of moral truths in every possible world. Whereas under naturalism, it is possible for there to be necessarily existing moral truths, but this is an additional hypothesis that you have to add to the naturalistic hypothesis. And it's also completely possible that there would be no objective morality at all. So I think all these data points are very expected, given that there is an all-good God who really cares about creation and desires good such as the ones listed above. But this is not expected given an indifferent, mindless universe that naturalism is attempting to posit. Finally, religious experience and desire. Throughout the majority of human history, humans have had some sort of religious practice, to the point where some studies have even pointed to the idea that religious desires and beliefs are baked into human psychology. Humans across time have had a variety of religious experiences on top of that. So we can find many accounts of people saying, I have felt the presence of a being that is all good, powerful, infinite, all those traits that theism purports to posit as its hypothesis. And I think given phenomenal conservatism, as well as the principle of testimony, these religious experiences give us good reason to suspect that such a being does exist. But on the other hand, given naturalism, we have no reason to expect these experiences, and more reason to expect that these types of experiences won't occur. I'm going to further support this by an analogy. So imagine that we have two people walking down the street, and one of them has a hypothesis that there is a magical flying unicorn that's attacking New York City right now. So someone's going to come up to, so the other friend, on the other hand, says, well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that there is a magical flying unicorn attacking people in the city and, like Godzilla, basically. So all of a sudden, some guy runs up to them and says, hey, there's a magical pink unicorn attacking the city, attacking the world. That seems to constitute evidence for the theory that that actually is the case, even if, maybe there might be some questions about the testimony of the person. Now, consider that more and more people start reporting this magical unicorn. It continues to bolster the evidence for the hypothesis that there is such a thing and lower the probability that the hypothesis that there isn't such a thing is true. So here's my final statement. I think naturalism is ultimately an overly reductionist hypothesis. Theism is an explanatory, powerful hypothesis. It has many data points it expects and explains, such as physical laws, consciousness, life, religious experience, and morality. While it is possible for naturalism to explain this data, it can only do so with additional hypotheses and theories. And I think once we sort of get into the weeds of discussing these different points of evidence, we'll start to see how naturalism, just as the basic definition formulated at the beginning, has to add additional theories and hypotheses to it in order to account for the data that is already expected and pretty much, and sometimes even entailed, given theism. So with that said, I believe I talked very quickly. So I am happy to concede the rest of my time and open up the floor to Chris's arguments for naturalism.
All right, thank you for that.
Yeah, that was a fantastic presentation, Chris. I just want to mention that. So I'll set my timer quickly. 15 minutes. Okay. So fundamentally, what's going on in this debate is we're comparing two theories, naturalism versus theism. And here's just one of my favorite quotes about atheism and naturalism, period. And it really encapsulates my attitude towards naturalism and atheism and the way I think about naturalism. So, sorry, how words mean, and this is a reference, the title is to an Aquinas treatise, so just wanted to mention that. Now, I take theism to refer to belief in a being that is subject to at least all of the following characteristics. And these would be moral perfection, infinity or lack of arbitrary limits, some form of omnipotence, and I intentionally left that open-ended because different theists have different definitions of omnipotence. Some say maximal power, and some say the ability to do all things that are logically possible, right? Since there are different definitions, I left that open-ended. And a substantial causal or grounding role in regards to contingent things, right? This being would have a significant role in grounding or causing aspects of the contingent universe, whether it be their very existence or governing laws regarding their behavior, as well as supreme agency and intelligence, which I believe is pretty self-explanatory. Now, for the sake of this debate, due to time constraints and perspicuity of the topic, we're not going to be investigating or talking about different models of God, which would be things like classical theism, open theism, neoclassical theism, right? That's not going to be addressed. All that we're going to be talking about are the most fundamental aspects of bare bones theism. Now, I take naturalism to refer to belief in an ontology that is subject to at least all of the following characteristics: a lack of agency and intentionality at the fundamental layer of reality. There could be conscious minds that are fundamental to reality, but reality doesn't exist insofar as it is a result of their intentions or their decisions. Rather, they exist as sort of a conscious substrate that does not will reality into existence. And so naturalism is still open to forms of idealism, but not any sort of agency or mind that brings the universe into existence. And there's also a rejection of exceptions to or violations of consistent laws of nature. No miracles, pretty self-explanatory. And natural causes exhaust the whole of causal reality. There is nothing evolved in reality as an effect or a cause that is in any way supernatural or not natural. Now, I take naturalism to be a very broad thesis, and it's compatible with every view from Alex Rosenberg's physics, scientific-based reductionism, to Eric Steinhardt's Platonic metaphysics. And so I wanted to be able to lay out these definitions as clearly as possible. Next, methodology, madness, and Mackie. Now, I will be going about the use of theoretical virtues as follows. I hold that we should favor theories that explain the most amount of data, have the most predictive power, and have the least amount of unnecessary postulations. And there are different ways to cash out and talk about theoretical virtues, but I believe that the above principles make the best sense of our exploration today. Basically, the gist of this is that we want to maximize the things that we can explain, our explanation, while minimizing our commitments, ontological or otherwise. And this quote from Mackie really hits the nail on the head on what all of these arguments come down to, which is the argument to the best explanation. Now, the first evidence in favor of naturalism is teleology. We encounter teleology in nature that is intrinsic and grounded in natural laws. Chemicals, organisms, and fundamental particles all display certain attributes and behaviors that are owed to their respective natures/kinds and natural laws, right? when we observe the behavior of, let's say, a plant or the human heart or a particular particle, right? We can talk about these functions and these attributes in terms of what the substance is and what its natural role is, right? Or certain laws. The human heart pumps blood in order to support the organism, which we could give some sort of evolutionary explanation to, right? And so the ability to reduce teleology down to purely natural causes, which is the thesis regarding teleology that I believe supported by the natural sciences, is highly expected under naturalism, as all teleology will be necessarily reducible to natural laws and substances. The fact that natural laws and properties or kinds can account for any sort of teleology or function that we see in nature, this makes perfect sense under naturalism. It would what would be predicted if teleology or the appearance of teleology exists. This is surprising under theism, however, as we would expect God to be the direct controller and orchestrator of all natural function. Although even if the theist contends the notion that natural teleology is not expected under theism, and in fact they say that it is expected under theism, or at least is as expected as it is under naturalism, they still face the issue that we do not need God to account for teleology, and that natural causes give a fully sufficient explanation of the data without adding on a new hypothesis. So even then, it's still evidence in favor of naturalism. The second evidence is divine hiddenness. Now, I take it as an irrefutable piece of data that there are certain individuals who desire to have a relationship with God, but find themselves unconvinced of God's existence either by evidential, rational, or revelatory experiential means, as well as individuals that have not been introduced to God in any relevant salvic sense. Now, this would refer to people who are open to Christianity, who want to form a relationship with God, but find themselves unable to believe that God, in fact, exists. And assuming that doxastic voluntarism is false, this is a plausible and, in fact, empirically irrefutable piece of data. And of course, there are individuals who have never been introduced to the Christian God or God of any particular religion in a relevant salvic sense, which is a way in which is relevant to their salvation. Now, this is extremely unexpected under theism, as we would expect God to bring about the salvation of all creatures, since theosis, which is union with God, right, is the highest of all possible goods. And so the failure of certain individuals to receive a fair chance of accepting God is strong evidence for naturalism. And Schellenberg, once again, hits the nail on the head regarding this issue. And the fact that this is a difficult issue for theism to cope with and explain. However, it is very expected and easy to explain for naturalism. The third evidence, God's mind or the divine intellect versus the human mind. Under theism, God possesses many of the same attributes of human minds, but to the maximal degree. However, the description of God's mind as afforded to us by most theists has nothing in common with any rational agent or mind that we have actual experience of. All rational agents that we know of use discursive, temporal thought processes are embodied agents dependent on biological processes and properties for cognition to occur and possess complex and varied psychological influences. Now, this background information is completely inconsistent with theism, which posits an immaterial, timeless, spaceless, perfect, simple, and sovereign being uninfluenced by contingent factors. Now, to be clear, these extra descriptors of theism that I have added in, I don't think that they're necessarily fundamental to theism itself. However, they're very common adjectives, and I could appeal to my earlier list of attributes of God, which would also work with this argument. So I just wanted to make that clear. The fourth evidence is science and explanation. Now, throughout most of human history, we have observed a substantial amount of rigorously evidenced and empirically verified natural explanations in scientific inquiry. On the other hand, we have seen no supernatural explanations that are backed with the same amount of evidential support as scientific and natural explanations are. On the contrary, a huge amount of supernatural explanations have been discredited in favor of natural and scientific explanations. Now, the history of science is highly unexpected under theism, since we would expect supernatural realities to be verifiable, either by direct observation or by consistent effects that supernatural beings or laws would cause, and that they would be present in our arsenal of explanations for phenomena. And this quote, which was cited by Paul Draper, in his paper, God, Science, and Naturalism, really encapsulates this notion, right? That as we look at the history of science, we see exactly what we don't expect under theism, which is the consistent reality and verifiability of supernatural realities, which is expected under naturalism since these things do not exist. So this is another piece of evidence that favors naturalism. The fifth evidence is evils. In our experience of the world, we encounter evils, both moral and natural. There are two kinds of evil in horrendous that I want to zero in on in this case, which are teleological and particular horrendous evils. Teleological evils are evils that are baked into the very nature of reality, evils that are present in the design plan of nature. Particular horrendous evils are specific examples of uniquely gratuitous and grotesque evils. An example of the first one would be carnivores, right? We have animals that are dependent on their survival, or dependent for their survival, on the suffering and mutilation of other living sentient creatures that can suffer tremendously. And an example of a particular horrendous evil would be the murder of Junko Futura or the Holocaust. Teleological evil is extremely unexpected under theism, given a maximally good designer of nature. And particular horrendous evils are unexpected given God's perfect will and goodness for all creatures. Right? The fact that we see evils, suffering that is embedded in the very nature of reality, the very way that nature itself functions, that's at this very zeroed in core of the way reality works, we see suffering and evil. This is extremely unexpected given an all good and all perfect designer of nature. On the other hand, naturalism predicts an indifferent universe with teleology that does not care about pain or suffering of the conscious creatures within it. And it makes sense that it would be punctuated by random instances of horrific violence, which would be particular horrendous evils. The sixth evidence is the conceptual vacuity of God. Theism makes certain claims about the nature of God, such as omnipotence, mentality, moral perfection, immateriality, and metaphysical necessity. However, these claims are in strong conflict with our background knowledge regarding all of these concepts. The only examples of true necessity that we know of, possibly, right, depending on your view in the philosophy of mathematics, would be abstract objects and concepts like abstract objects and concepts such as mathematics and logic, right, which are acausal and non-concrete, which is far different from a metaphysically necessary causal mental substance. Right, a mental substance or a mind that is concrete and necessary runs counter to what we know about necessity. As we know, all that could possibly be necessary from our experience are mathematical theorems, numbers, universals, things of that nature, which are not causal and are not concrete. Moral agency is another example of a supposed attribute of God that is inconsistent with our background knowledge. Because when we as moral agents experience things like dependency on others, right, for our moral status, guilt, distinct personality traits that mold our moral character, all of which contradict the notion of a supreme, necessary, and morally perfect creator. So Bell gives us a really good quote on how the concept of God is pretty much runs counter to everything we know about the world as such. The seventh evidence, the nature of human religiosity. Humans have a psychosocial predilection towards believing in a higher power, forming religious groups, and constructing complex theological systems, which is something that my opponent concedes. The humans do have a natural tendency towards believing in God and forming religious systems. Now, these religious groups and associations tend to be focused on group unity, idiosyncratic ethical systems, and wildly distinct metaphysical perspectives. Right? Compare polytheistic primitive religions to the monotheistic religions such as Christianity, Judaism. We see a huge conceptual gulf between the two, or between the many. Now, the tribalistic and deeply diverse nature of human religiosity is expected in naturalism, because rational social agents will form groups based on commonly held beliefs and values that serve an evolutionary purpose. Excuse me, it's not unexpected that humans, in order to survive, will form groups that allow them to defend against other groups and survive in their environment. This is expected under naturalism. This is, however, not expected under theism, under which a perfectly good being would desire the salvation of all creatures and lead me to the truth of reality. The fact that there's an extremely fractured system of religious groups, and the fact that they exhibit qualities which are highly expected under evolutionary naturalism, is unexpected in theism, as we would expect religiosity to be more coherent, cohesive, and to be more in line of what we would expect from the rest of theism. Now, in the end, theism is an odious postulation. Theism is an unnecessary theory for the data that it purports to explain. Contingency, life, consciousness, objective morality, and human religiosity can all be accounted for under naturalism, with the same appeals that theists would make without having any of the data points that count against naturalism, or that count against theism, right? The naturalists can avoid all of this. And ultimately, theism has to deal with a plethora of data points that are widely unexpected, assuming it's truth, as well as being unhelpful and arbitrary as an explanatory force. And this quote from Oppie is a bit of it's not directly related to the slide, but it's about how I believe, in general, that our best ways of getting closer to the truth about the philosophy of religion and philosophy in general is dialogue and conversation with the best of our opponents, which I hold Chris to be one of the best of the theistic opposition. And overall, cope, seethe, dilate, perhaps. See, I have depicted the naturalist as the Giga Chad, so theism has, in conclusion, been debunked. And that is the end of my presentation.
I knew one of us was going to do that. I originally had that in my slides, but I was like, nah, I gotta have a different conclusion. But
Very sad that you didn't have it on there.
I am. I made an edit and everything, but nonetheless, fantastic presentation. Look forward to responding to it. So again, thank you.
All right, you have 10 minutes to respond. We'll start that now.
The timer just went off.
So Chris has presented 7 lines of evidence to which I hope to respond. I'm going to respond to these in the order of what I feel are the weakest arguments to the strongest arguments, so I can kind of get the ones that I find less compelling out of the way to address the stronger ones. So first, argument 4 on the success of science. I think there's a problem with this argument. The scientific method has a selection bias towards natural explanations, as it is the study of the natural world and the processes within the natural world. But to infer this from this, the failure of supernatural explanations, I think would be like appealing to metal detectors to argue for the probability of non-metal materials. Since science is going to have a selection bias towards natural explanations, it cannot in principle serve as evidence against supernatural explanations. And I think this argument also favors a type of empiricist epistemology, but again, that empiricist epistemology is going to be inclined towards objects of experience, which again has a bias towards natural objects. Next, teleology. As I presented in my opening statement, the natural dispositions of objects towards orderliness and uniform behavior constitute significant evidence for theism. God is also not an arbitrary postulation to explain natural laws. Under Chris's account, natural laws themselves are intrinsic to objects. But why do these objects have their nature at all? It seems as though we can take the explanation further if they're contingent and explain the dispositions of objects and the intelligibility to which they are ordered as being the product of a divine intelligence. This explanation is satisfactory and also avoids a type of bruteness because we can motivate reasons why God would want to bring about objects which have an orderly endedness. Now, Chris can deny that the dispositions of the objects are necessary or contingent by saying that they're actually necessary. But I would argue that you have to add that as a thesis to your hypothesis, which adds more specificity and therefore complexity. Furthermore, by positing necessary physical laws, you go against what is our most common intuition that physical laws could have been otherwise. So again, that seems to go against some of our background knowledge. On your 3rd and 6th arguments, I think that they rely on a general conceptual concerns about God violating our background knowledge, since it posits a necessary being, as well as other concerns about human minds related to God's mind. However, as my first argument shows, both positions are going to need to posit some necessary foundation to account for contingent facts. So both theories will end up going against our background knowledge in some ways. As I've shown, a natural necessity is going to go against a ton of our background knowledge. I would also add that, as I've shown in my argument from religious experience, many people do have experiences of immaterial beings, as well as a being of infinite power, love, and goodness. And I argue that these religious experiences sort of outweigh that concern that this goes against our background knowledge, since for a lot of people, it's perfectly in line with their background knowledge. I also want to add that in regards to your 3rd argument, I think the philosophy of mind as well as neuroscience is still a space where much debate is occurring. And I think it would be preemptive to argue from views about neuroscience and philosophy of mind about how the mind works to make considerations about God's existence. I think that you would need to kind of narrow in on a more specific theory of mind and show how that lowers the probability of theism. But I don't think that that can be done without narrowing in on a more specific theory. So now I'm going to address divine hiddenness, and I'm going to also kind of group the seventh argument in with this, because the seventh argument is kind of intertwined with divine hiddenness in that they both concern ourselves with why God kind of is leaving this sort of epistemic question open as to his existence and his nature for a lot of people. So I first want to posit that it's entirely possible that God is going to grant divine revelation to those who are on their deathbed. And this would be anyone who is, holding incorrect beliefs about his existence, about his nature, about what religious paths he might want us to follow. And I think in this moment, God would no longer remain hidden for non-resistant non-believers, as well as people who hold incorrect religious views. And I think that this account of God giving this type of grace to people also fits in with data told to us by people who have had religious experiences, such as Saint Faustina, as well as people who have had near-death experiences that have radically changed their worldviews. So I think having this helps create sort of a safety net. And then the question is now, why does God make this revelation occur to people at their death? Why not just have it occur forever and all times? And I think that there's two reasons. One is epistemic freedom, and then the other is types of epistemic and historical life experience differences between humans. I think for some humans, their life experiences are such that deathbed revelation is the only way for them to eventually come to truth and grace and persist in that type of grace until their deaths. Further, God has these deathbed revelations as a safety net for us so that we can come to conclusions about the world around us and about God's nature and about his existence in a way that we are epistemically free without him sort of looking over our shoulders and making sure we're always coming to the right conclusions. But he's still able to allow us to come to this truth at some point in our lives. Finally, in response to evil, I want to propose a theodicy. And I want to make something very clear here. I think a theodicy can, while not completely undercut an argument from evil, I think it can diminish it enough so that arguments for theism can sort of outweigh the considerations for evil. So I'm going to tenuously call this a world-building theodicy. It is one that I've discussed with John Buck previously, so I do owe a lot of credit to him, though if I mess anything up on this, that's totally on me because I'm presenting it. So in the world-building theodicy, God absolutely can bring about both a perfect world and an initially imperfect world. But God has chosen to bring about an imperfect world so that finite creatures can achieve the greater good of helping to create a perfect world. This means there will be instances of decay and destruction alongside creation and flourishing, all in order for the finite creatures that undergo these experiences to be a vital part of the building of a perfect world. When God finally does help us complete the picture, as many theistic religions hold will happen at the end of time, these finite creatures will be brought back and understand the role of their suffering and flourishing and how it played into the creation of a perfect world, thus maximizing the great goods of world building. This will also involve processes of evolution, whereby destruction in creatures will at least play some part in the development of new and greater life. And further, this also involves God allowing, though providentially, a certain degree of chance and indeterminacy, which gives creatures the freedom to play a role in the creation of the world. So let me kind of lay out an analogy for how I think this world-building theodicy works. There was a group of Minecraft users, and they all got together, and this is a true story. They built a full-scale replica of Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings on Minecraft. And it took them like 5 years to put this together. Now, imagine that you are a major Lord of the Rings fan and you're also a huge Minecraft fan and you love building in Minecraft. Imagine your friend comes up to you one day and says, "Hey, check out this life-size replica of Middle-earth that I built in Minecraft. And I want you to check it out and look at it." I mean, you would go and you would enjoy it, but I think part of you would feel sad that, this is just all being presented to you without you being given any role in the creation of this ultimate really great good that you would have loved to take part in and be a part of and have your name attached to it. Sorry if I got feedback there. But then suppose that your friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, look, I would really love for you to take part in building this world with me over the course of 5 years. And yes, there is going to be suffering and there's going to be, a lot of time commitment and there's going to be, late nights and being super tired, working on this build with us. And, maybe you're going to have to give up going out with your friends one night because we all have to get together and work on this project. but in the end, it will be worth it because you will have played a significant role in creating the perfect world. And I think that's a really good analogy for why God is allowing these types of evils to occur. It's also that people can kind of come together, and finite creatures such as animals and even single-celled organisms can come together and in spite of the fact that they are just a small part of the universe and a small part of the timeline, play an infinitely significant role in God's perfect creation. And I believe with a theodicy like this in place, we can diminish the strength of arguments from suffering and teleological evil and allow my case and my arguments for theism to overtake the ones Chris has presented. With that said, I am happy to concede the rest of my time and hand it over to Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a very impressive rebuttal, and I look forward to rebutting your rebuttal and debunking theism for like the 80th time now. But all jokes aside, that was a great presentation, and I look forward to responding. So if you guys are ready, I will proceed with my 10-minute rebuttal.
All right, starting now.
Oh, did you start the timer? Okay. Right, so there are so in this rebuttal, I'll be trying to address some of Chris's criticisms against me, as well as his overall case. So starting with his case, probably the biggest issue with it is that we can appeal to something called the fallacy of understated evidence. Now, the fallacy of understated evidence is when we use a particular piece of evidence or data point to support a hypothesis, yet we leave out many of the other pieces of evidence related to this data point that actually weigh in favor against that hypothesis. Now, this can undercut every single one of Chris's arguments, aside from contingency. Life, consciousness, morality, religiosity, and physical laws, as I've shown in my arguments, all in some way, shape, or form undercut theism when all things are considered. For example, life, right? Life as such does seem to provide some evidence for theism. However, when we consider that life is fundamentally designed to inflict immense suffering and pain across pretty much all life, right? All life that is sentient, which is likely thousands or beyond thousands, obviously, of different species, right? This is not expected in theism. Even though life as such might be expected, when we consider the amount of immense suffering, pain, and death that is built into the very nature of life, it would seem unlikely that God would design life that is made to inflict suffering as a functional role of the organisms. Next, we have morality, which, much like life, does seem to initially lend credence to theism. However, when we consider the fact that there is significant moral disagreement, moral progress, right, and we find entire civilizations in extreme moral error where they will commit horrific moral travesties, which the theists will likely concede, then this piece of data seems more expected in naturalism, as we as naturalists can posit objective morality that humans gradually discover. Their cognitive faculties are attuned to grasping or obtaining their teleology, which would include moral oughts, right? However, they will be fallible in doing this in the same way they're fallible at science, right? And so this, all data considered in regards to morality, actually supports naturalism. And next, there is consciousness, which plays into my third argument, right? That when we first consider consciousness as evidence for theism, right, this seems plausible. Theism postulates a conscious mind, and the fact that there are conscious minds that are rational, social, moral agents seems to be expected of theism, while an indifferent universe would not seem to predict this. However, when we consider the full set of facts about consciousness, we see that consciousness is fraught with cognitive biases, moral failures, and the entire rest of the argument for moral agency against theism that I posited earlier, right? And other factors of consciousness that weigh against theism, all things considered, right? And then there's religiosity, which I also addressed and showed that the religious instinct actually is expected in naturalism, considering how people tend to form groups that are evolutionary. That there's an evolutionary expectation that people will form groups based on similar values and form tribes in order to fight against other tribes, right? This is a biologically highly beneficial occurrence, and it's something that we would expect in naturalism. And this goes unaddressed by Chris. He does not address how this group tribalism and these deeply fragmented ethical systems are expected under naturalism. He kind of left that as a concession almost. And so that undercuts most of Chris's case, right? When we consider the full facts about his arguments, we see that they, in fact, don't really favor theism, but rather naturalism. Life is fraught with suffering. Consciousness is fraught with biological influences and biases. Morality is fraught with failure, the failure of moral of moral epistemic faculties, and religiosity serves a wonderful evolutionary benefit. Now, the only argument that Chris posed that does not fall under the fallacy of understated evidence is his argument from contingency, which I reject for a couple reasons. Number one, I don't think it's necessary to posit a necessarily existent being in order to explain contingency. I don't believe that Chris provided a satisfactory reason as to why this is necessary in order to explain contingent things, right? And so I don't see any reason to adopt the necessity of positing a necessary being to explain contingency. Plus, Chris made the argument that as naturalism tries to explain contingent things, it must get more and more specific as a hypothesis, which is something that I would concede. However, naturalism is already far, far, far less specific than theism is. So adding some certain qualifications and specifications on naturalism, it is still just as intrinsically probable as theism, or still more intrinsically probable than theism. So even with these specifications, it still wins out over theism. And a couple other arguments, pieces of argumentation put forth by Chris, aside from his main case, would be regarding the natural sciences, right? I made this argument I stated the argument in such a way that natural explanations are convertible scientific explanations, right? So the argument isn't that science fails to find supernatural explanations. It's that scientific or natural explanations dominate our arsenal of explanation in order to account for natural, psychological, and other data, whereas we have no supernatural data that is evidentially supported or rationalistically supported as much as the scientific natural explanations do. So that objection against the argument fails and it remains unassailed. Next, there is the argument from natural necessity against a necessary being. And since I've already discussed how I don't think this is necessary, we could shave off the objection just like that. However, even if I did posit a necessary being, there's also the fact that I pose an argument that a necessary mental substance also faces many of the same issues that this would face, right? And so on that issue, they would level out. Plus, considering that there are a lot of other conceptual issues with theism that I've already posed, beyond just necessity, while naturalism would only face the necessity issue in regards to background knowledge, naturalism once again wins out on the issue of background knowledge. And in regards to the argument from physical or minds that pose a conceptual gulf between human contingent minds and God's necessary mind, there's also the fact that neuroscience and philosophy of mind, while highly contentious, I've not used any theses or theories within the neuroscience or philosophy of mind that are at all contentious or unexpected. All I posit is the fact that hormones, for example, influence the way we think. But certain physical aspects do have some effect on the way we cognize as human creatures. That it has some effect and some role in the way we cognize. That our bodies, biology, and things of that nature affect our minds. That's all I'm claiming, which is something that we have extreme evidence for, right? So I'm not relying on anything that's contentious or indeterminate in neuroscience or physical, or assuming physicalism is true. It's just that our minds are influenced by the fact that we are within bodies, and that there are biological processes that go on within us. So that dispenses with the neuroscientific argument against my third argument. So that one once again goes unassailed. And there are a couple of pieces that I still want to get to, but I'm going to skip to the one that I believe is most important, which is the fact his theodicy, right, that he's worked on with John Buck, which is that it is better for God to create an imperfect world initially and have beings participate in his goodness in order to obtain a perfect world rather than simply starting off with a perfect world. And he gave a nice analogy to encapsulate that idea. However, this does not deal at all, not in the closest, with teleological evil. Right? The evil or the suffering that he's described are things that would be sort of a challenge, right? They're incidental. They happen to happen when you're trying to achieve your goal, and ultimately when you overcome them, they feel more successful. However, an evil or suffering that is simply baked into the design of an experience or of the world is not accounted for in the theodicy, right? The fact that wolves are designed, well, to phrase that in a different way, Chris is talking about obstacles or challenges. I'm talking about function and teleology. It is the goal of a wolf to predate a weak animal and cause it suffering in order to survive. This isn't a challenge that it must overcome. This is something that it is designed to do. And plus, even if he argued that it is a goal, right? It is something that the wolf must achieve or the predator must achieve in order for a greater good in the end. This just seems highly implausible, and we have no reason to think this is so. And we have a better explanation in that it's simply the way teleology has won out. And plus, my argument from teleology, right? He objected that it was right that we would still end up with some sort of brute fact, possibly, or that God is still necessary as an explanation for the fact that these kinds exist. However, I don't really see a reason why this is necessary, right? The reason certain behaviors and attributes are expected given a certain kind or essence is because that's simply what the essence is. It results in these certain properties and attributes. That's necessarily the case, right? It's a logical necessity. And so the fact that we have to explain essences and kinds as such is undercut by my objection to his contingency argument. And the final point that I want to get at very briefly is the fact that what was I going to say? Is the fact that in order for his position of theism to account for the data points, he has to add plenty of other postulations with his original hypothesis, right? The idea that God would, for example, his theodicy makes it adds reasons to God's actions that would specify the hypothesis. Plus the fact that God would desire to specifically create biological life that functions through evolution, adding something onto the hypothesis. The fact that God wanted to create agents that have a specific type of consciousness with cognitive biases, adding onto the hypothesis, right? Any of his objections or responses to my arguments, and inbuilt in his regular case, includes plenty of add-ons to theism that make it more less likely than naturalism ultimately. And I know I'm over time. I'm sorry. I'm finished.
All right, thank you. All right, so now we're going to enter into the 15-minute back and forth dialogue, and then we'll go into a short Q&A. So I'll just let you guys take this. You can just ask questions one at a time. So
yeah, I think I'll kick things off. I think you correctly pointed out that I didn't exactly justify my contingency argument, and I want to kind of jump back to that here right now. So I think that it's the best explanation for contingent facts is going to be something necessary, right? Consider the other options. One, there's the explanation of contingent facts that there's a contingent fact which is a brute fact. Well, that seems to be explanatorily vacuous, right? It's just, well, that object it's just a brute fact. I mean, that seems to lack explanation at all. I think the other two explanations that kind of avoid necessity would be something like an infinite regress, but that seems to have a very complex ontology because you have to posit an infinite number of contingent things to explain contingency at all. And I think even then it's questionable as to whether or not that actually explains contingency rather than just creating an infinite per accidents chain to explain contingency. And then I think the only other option might be something like a circular causal chain, but I think that there would probably be a lot of metaphysical problems with that type of circular explanation. So I'm just curious as to why you wouldn't want to posit something necessary to explain contingent facts.
The naturalists can pose a necessary explanation, but I just don't think they have to. I think they can pose either a brute fact or a circular explanatory chain and be coherent and reasonable in their ontology, and they simply don't need to appeal to necessity. They might, and considering the other evidences that I supported, I would concede that this would decrease the intrinsic probability of naturalism, and it would go against our background knowledge. But considering how much more theism goes against our background knowledge and how much more specific theism is overall, naturalism still wins out. But I simply don't take that route because I'm skeptical of metaphysical necessity, right? That's even a coherent concept, right? Because as I described, the only necessity that we're familiar with is acausal, non-concrete facts or objects.
Yeah.
So the idea that there can be necessity at all is something that I am skeptical of.
So quick question there, and then I'll let you jump into your question if you had any. So you said that you're skeptical of any types of necessity that aren't kind of abstract. But earlier you were positing that something like teleology is necessary. And I think we can consider other types of necessity, like synthetically necessary truths, such as necessarily water is H2O. I don't think that's really abstract. I think that's very concrete. So I don't think that goes against our background knowledge at all. But that was my only other point, and I'm happy to let you hop into any questions that you had, and I'll kind of let you bring it off.
Well, that would seem to sort of miss the point of my objection, which is that I don't believe I thought maybe I should have clarified this, but I talked about it in my presentation, which is that I don't believe in any necessarily existing causal concrete substance. I believe that an identity relation can be necessary, right? That's because it's an identity relation, right? Conceding this is far different from conceding a causal substance that is concrete and necessary. Saying that 1 equals 1 isn't the same kind of necessity as saying that there's a necessarily existing concrete entity that brings the world about. So there's still a gulf there that allows me to affirm one without having to affirm the other. So I feel like that would bypass that objection. And so the question I wanted to pose to you is, you talk about naturalism as indifferent, right? But you seem to sort of assume a metaphysical indifference rather than an ethical one, right? When I talk about indifference, I mean an indifference to sentient life, their experiences and suffering, right? I believe that the natural world does not care about our suffering or about the suffering of sentient beings. But when you tend to use indifference, you use it in the sense of the universe would be indifferent in regards to physical laws, and we would expect a disordered universe. But there doesn't seem to be any entailment under the indifference that I've described that naturalism would entail disorder or chaos, right? It would seem very plausible that naturalism can entail teleology and consistent laws while not entailing caring or value of sentient life.
Yeah, great question. So I don't believe that naturalism entails like chaos. I just think it's more likely, given naturalism, that there will be chaos. And in terms of like the difference between like that ethical and metaphysical indifference, I'm curious as to how you would get a type of difference given naturalism, because naturalism, kind of as you stated at the beginning, and let me actually get that real quick. I just want to make sure I have that right. Given the definition you gave, it was there's no intent or consciousness that's fundamental to reality, or at least that's like actively willing, or I don't want to say that because it might go against your Schopenhauerian position, but like there's no like actual
decision
making. So I'm curious as to how you would get a type of difference towards these types of other metaphysical considerations that you would, at least a better one than theism gets, because you have an intentional agent at the foundation.
So you're asking why under naturalism I would posit this distinction, right? Why under naturalism we would expect there to be a difference between ethical indifference and metaphysical indifference?
Yeah.
That's just your question, right? Because I think it's because naturalism, by definition, in the one that I gave, and I believe we can agree on, right? We instantly shave off any fundamental moral agency that cares about sentient life, right? That's off the table as a naturalist. However, you don't take off the table, like I've been talking about, teleology and nature's function, which are embedded into nature, right? So I can still say, oh, the universe isn't indifferent in regards to order. Look at these natural laws, these substances and their natures as they abide by their functions and act in certain ways. But I can say, oh, naturalism doesn't care about your survival. Well, it possibly can in the sense that like the substance has a teleology to survive, but it doesn't in the sense that the universe as a whole has no problem making you suffer tremendously. There's no function against it, right? There's no moral agency conducting it as to where that would not be the case. So that's how I would cash that out.
Yeah, I guess so. Like, again, I'm yeah. Okay, so I get what you're saying, but like, I guess I'm still a little bit confused because the naturalist hypothesis is just the proposition that only natural things exist. No intent or consciousness is fundamental to reality. Like, why would that lead to an expectation of certain natural dispositions? Like, just given that as our definition.
I believe that there is, so to sort of elaborate on what I mean in my like argument for teleology regarding that definition, is that I believe that naturalism would predict a reducibility of any appearance of teleology or teleology to natural causes, right? And I believe that you would agree that assuming naturalism is true, if we encounter this phenomenon, it would be reducible to natural causes. That's definitional, right? And that links back to my definition, right? And compared to now what was I going to say? Oh, but I don't believe that this would necessarily, that naturalism directly predicts teleology, period. I don't necessarily believe that it predicts not intentionally, but laws and consistent function. I don't believe naturalism entails that right off the bat, but it does entail that assuming this phenomenon exists, it is reducible to natural causality. But it's still something that could happen under naturalism, right? There can be teleology, and there can be the appearance of teleology. And so it's not something that's shaved off of the hypothesis like moral agency or moral value is.
Okay. Okay. So I have a question, but I want to let you ask your question right now because I want to give you that opportunity too.
Okay, so many of the questions I am wanting to ask right now are, what do you think about this objection that I gave? But I'm gonna refrain from that, because if you want to respond to my objections, which I gave in my rebuttal, you are already free to, right? So I'm gonna bring up new questions that I have that are more relevant at this point. And one of them is, in both your analogies, right, there seems to be a sort of distance between that and what's actually occurring in the arguments. For example, your magical unicorn analogy. I believe it would be more accurate to say that, let's say there are these two people discussing that there's a magical flying unicorn that's wreaking havoc. You said like wreaking havoc on a city, I believe, or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's just doing what magical unicorns do. I don't know. Whatever
Right.
you want to say.
But that this is what one person says, hey, I believe this is the case. Somebody says, no, I don't. They counter somebody who says, hey, I just saw a magical flying unicorn destroying the city. And so this would seem to provide evidence for the fact that, oh, there probably is magical flying unicorn. That adds credence to that hypothesis. But let's say another person came up and said, oh man, I saw a magical leprechaun like drink the entire Pacific Ocean, right? And another person came and said, man, I saw this gigantic dragon just burn the city to embers. This would not necessarily, this would actually lend evidence against the magical unicorn hypothesis, I'd say, considering the fact that we had plenty of these visions and experiences, but none of them, but they show certain discord, right? Which is not what we would expect if the magical unicorn hypothesis is true, right? We would expect multiple people to be like, oh, there's a unicorn. But considering that there are plenty of other beings present, right, that people are seeing, this would be more expected under people being just batshit crazy, right? Or we could say that people are under the influence of some sort of, just under the influence, right? And tying this back into the argument, I believe it would be more accurate. I believe this is a more accurate analogy because we have people who have a religious experience from psychoactive drugs of being at some sort of unity, right, with the whole of reality, like feeling of being one with being. This is far different from the experience that a Hindu might have of their religious, of Brahman, right? Or of a Christian's experience of Christ, or a Muslim's experience of Allah. And so the discrepancy between these religious experiences, and this is another example of what's the fallacy of understated evidence, right? No one consider how much discord is in between the different religious experiences, how they tend to occur within certain groups and adherence to these religions already. We once again see a better explanation arising, which is the natural one. So I was wondering what your response to that is.
Yeah, so I worry that if we accept that differences in religious experience constitute evidence against theism as such, then we open ourselves up to a type of epistemic uncertainty with regards to other phenomenal experiences. So I think, for example, if three people see a car crash, they're going to end up in the situation reporting a bunch of different things. But I don't think that we should take that as evidence that undercuts that the fundamental thing that occurred was a car crash, even though they might report, maybe there was 3 police cars at the scene versus, 4 ambulances, or maybe one person saw that one car was on fire, or one person saw that none were on fire, that type of thing. So I worry if we say that, well, there's differences in religious experience, so it sort of undercuts religious experience, that same line of reasoning would undercut our epistemic views about other things about the external world. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. And the other thing is, it seems that a lot of religious experiences are seeing something similar and then interpreting it through a different lens, right? So, a Christian and a Muslim can experience a source of pure love and goodness and infinite being. The Christian's going to say that's Jesus, and the Muslim's going to say that's Allah. But I think that they're ultimately looking at the same thing, God, and just interpreting it through their different lenses. That's why I'm skeptical of an argument from different religious experiences to kind of undercut religious experience as a whole.
I have to drop off for a couple minutes. I'll be right back.
Okay.
While we're waiting, maybe we can do a couple of questions. I'll just I don't have dead air, and then maybe he can respond to some of these. So this is one. This is kind of generic. So who is your favorite philosopher?
Who's my favorite philosopher? I've got to go with Dr. Rob Koons right now. He's still been a major influence on my philosophical beliefs. Even though I'm, currently really big into evidential cases right now, I still do find that there's many very powerful deductive arguments. But I am currently working on an inductive project, so this is sort of why I'm here. But Rob Koons is a big influence on my type of deductive reasoning side of thinking, and especially thinking through things like modal contingency arguments. So yeah, big shout out to Dr. Rob Koons.
All right, and then there was another one. Can something other than God be both necessary and concrete?
That's a great question. And that's totally going to depend on your view of stage 2 contingency arguments. So if you think that certain stage 2 contingency arguments, perhaps such as, again, Dr. Rob Koons' argument from necessary being to pure actuality, if you think those succeed, then the answer is going to be no, there can be nothing other than God that is necessary and concrete. But if you think that there is no successful stage 2 argument, and I've granted that for the sake of discussion in my opening statement, then yes, there can be such things, but the question is then how much, what does a naturalist have to posit to serve as that necessary concrete foundation and explanation? And I think in that case, again, as I've argued before, it's going to add additional complexity and specificity. And at least in the case of the contingency argument, I argue that puts it at least on equal level with theism in terms of explaining contingent facts. Why am I so based? I try, I just got to do it, man. It's got to be based. It's like, it's not really something like you strive for. It's just a state of mind.
All right. What about the people that die near instantaneously? Are they deprived on the 3 visitations from Christ?
Yeah. So in the question about the 3 visitations, that's making references to St. Faustina's view. So I don't think so. I think that there's a lot of good evidence to support the idea that, as we reach death, our perception of time slows down. And I think within that slowed down perception of time, we're able to have more experiences. So for example, in a 1 second experience, I might be able to experience, say, like 10 minutes of experience. And I think it's also possible that God is able to slow down the sense of experience for a person in that situation such that they can have the necessary experience that, sort of undercuts divine hiddenness.
Does theism predict equal opportunity for everyone to form a personal relationship with God? If so, did people 10,000 years ago have the same opportunity as Abraham?
It's a great question. I'm going to say it does seem like if we were given welcome back, Chris. But I'm going to answer this question and then we'll hop back into our discussion. I think it's, he's very likely giving an all good God that he would want a relationship with everyone. So I think it does predict that. But I think that, with the St. Faustina defense that I've presented earlier, I think that those opportunities are actualized in the lifetime of every human.
All right, so what we're going to do is you guys have about 3 minutes left of open dialogue, and then we'll go to some more of the questions, and then we'll close out from there. So I'm going to start the timer and go ahead and go now.
Okay, so I'm just gonna finish my point, which was we were talking about the religious experiences and like the diversity, and you brought up an example in which there would be diverse experiences, but we'd still be justified in believing it, and how my objection would pose some unnecessary skepticism towards those examples. and plus the fact that there is a lot of unity among these religious experiences that I seem to kind of go over. Is that the gist of your objection? I want to make sure that I'm still following, since I was.
Yes, and that the unity is often, the difference in the views is often an example of them seeing unity but having it interpreted through their own personal religious beliefs.
Right. And so the first objection I would like to make is that when we talk about the nature of the religious experiences, this ignores my objection about psychoactive drugs and a sort of pantheistic experience, because there seems to be a large conceptual gulf between experience the love of God, right? God revealing himself to you in all his glory, and the feeling of I am one with the universe. I'm ontologically united with the rest of being, right? I'm merely a wave in the sea of reality. Right? That seems to be distinct in nature from the other religious experiences. And you do bring up an interesting point about skepticism and examples of discrepancy between claims where we would be justified in believing in believing the people making those claims, right? Believe their testimony. But I think there's a problem here because there is a strong agreement on the fundamental nature of the occurrence, right? Let's just, like, I think you gave it a car crash, right? The amount of people in the car, like what their gender was, the color of their hair, right? There may be different perspectives on these particular details. However, on the core factor, they are the same, right? There is no disagreement regarding what happened at the root of it all. And plus, this is a public encounter, right? Of people giving different perspectives on the same thing. But we're talking about private psychological experiential experiences, right? So I'm not sure if that analogy is correct in the sense that I'm not sure that there's a symmetry between a private conscious experience and a public event. Plus, I think there is a asymmetry in the nature of religious experiences, where we have one person who experiences the love of the creator of the universe and the one who feels at home and united with the rest of being, but nothing of the nature of a distant creator. And so on both counts, I believe that the objection would fail.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time to address that, so I'm just going to put that to the side so I can bring up my other question. You were talking about moral disagreements. Could we really be moral without the ability to have moral disagreements to kind of come to conclusions about what is morally right and morally wrong? It seems like, moral disagreements allow us to, again, as my theodicy and John Buck's theodicy puts forward, that we're able to help build about a perfect world, and part of that would come from the ability to have moral disagreements and determine what is morally right and morally wrong, and us working towards that. And another point I wanted to make was you mentioned something about there are types of people use their moral agency to commit immoral acts, and I agree, but it seems like it's impossible to have moral agency and have them only commit morally good acts, because moral agency requires a type of free will. So it seems like without the moral freedom to commit intrinsically evil actions, we couldn't have moral agency at all. We would just be only committing good actions, and that wouldn't really constitute a type of agency.
Is God a moral agent?
Yeah.
So God can commit morally incorrect acts.
Yep, got me there. I'll think about that one.
And that's the argument that I was talking about earlier about the background knowledge, right? So in that case, contradiction with theism. So I want to leave now. Debunks my opponent. So now I'll go to side. I just want to say briefly that.
Okay, and this will be the last point, and then we're gonna do the Q&A.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to add that I do think, along with that issue, there's also the problem of the fact that God could allow there could be a sort of moral disagreement, right, and moral rational discussion, right, some moral failings, right, and an ability to congregate and consider what moral truths are, what is right and wrong, right? I feel like that's an essential part of the human experience. However, it's not an essential part of the human experience, and it's not expected under theism that there would be people in such moral error that they believe that the systematic torture and murder of particular individuals is fine, right, and it's in fact a moral good. We can have moral disagreements about what's right and wrong under theism. That's not unexpected, but it is unexpected that these moral failings would be so egregious and have such a gulf between them that some people are in the moral right when they address that, hey, the senseless killing of individuals is wrong, while others are so far off that not only are they wrong in their moral conclusions, but they also will commit these tremendously evil moral acts, right? We can have moral disagreement without this amount of suffering and evil, right? So I believe that I can concede your objection, but also my argument remains intact. So that's the end of my point there.
Yeah, and again, I think that pretty much is the time. So just kind of throwing it out there, because I feel like there was a lot of points that we had to brush over for the sake of time in this discussion. So I'm happy to, continue this with you, obviously off this debate. We follow each other on Twitter, so we could always discuss these points probably in more detail with, writing to each other and stuff. So yeah, I think that would be good, especially and truth conducive. So for sure.
All right, yeah, thanks for that. And for Youth Resist, would a big conjunctive set of contingent facts be itself contingent? If so, wouldn't a theory that explains the big conjunctive set of contingent facts be more explanatory than one that does not?
Yeah, first off, I think the idea of explaining facts is kind of nonsensical, right? We would, we all expect things that we don't explain things about the world. We explain the existence of substances, contingent beings, a thing's function, its properties, right? But we don't necessarily explain facts or propositions, right? And so, John just in a question mark. But right, so like when we try to explain something, we explain something that's going on naturally, something that's going on in the world. And so the big conjunctive set of contingent facts isn't a substantial entity in any relevant sense, right? There are different contingent beings and different contingent substances, but to say that there is one big contingent fact isn't something I would take to be the case, right? There's nothing that substantially needs to be explained at all, since the big conjunctive set of contingent facts isn't a contingent substance or concrete entity that is the type that is relevant to being explained. So I don't think the set of contingent facts needs to be explained. Plus, we could appeal to like a sort of self-explanatory chain, right, where a set is explained by its members, right, where the fact that there is a set at all is explained because of the fact that its members exist, right? That seems to be satisfactory for explaining why the set exists, because its members exist. There's nothing else that goes on in being a set. So that's generally my objection to that. My latter response is probably more convincing, right? But I still believe the previous yes. Okay, so the thing about this is that I am not...
Wait. Okay, so let me read the question in case somebody's listening. So we'll transition to the next question. So since you're an idealist, aren't you already committed to the existence of minds that don't depend upon brains in order to exist?
Yes, but metaphysically, I do believe that minds are fundamental. However, I do believe that our cognition is dependent on physical structures, which ultimately are due to I don't like this question because it gets too deep into my specific metaphysics and is relevant to the conversation. But generally, I believe that the external world is constructed by our perception of it, right? Which gets itself to, which is due to like the metaphysically fundamental will to live, right, or the system of evolution, right, of natural selection. I believe is in some way metaphysically fundamental, right? So ultimately, the function of natural selection and adaptation is fundamental to things on a metaphysical level, right? And so minds are still affected by this structure, right? And so our cognizing of the world and our construction of the physical world affects our minds, right? Just the fact that mind is fundamental does not exclude it from being affected by other factors aside from itself, which is what God would be, right? So even though I reject physical substances in my ontology, I shave that off, I still believe that minds are contingent and they're affected by structures that we perceive, and that they are dependent, flawed, and all these things that would still count against this argument. So ultimately, John's objection sucks, like John himself does. Kidding, of course. Is evolutionary naturalism a more specific type of naturalism, therefore less intrinsically probable? Yes, it is, but it's true. So, that kind of sounds like a meme answer, but like when I refer to evolutionary naturalism, I'm just referring to naturalism which includes evolution, biological evolution existing, right? So this is a proven fact. So the fact this is more specific is not really a relevant or cogent objection.
All right. Sorry, I'm pulling up the next one.
I'm going to
save that one. You both confess that Parmenides is right, and Eleatic philosophy offers us the only coherent metaphysical account.
So true, bestie.
Yes, you're right.
All right, for both of you, which argument against theism do you think is the strongest and/or carries the most evidential weight?
I'll go first. So I think that the strongest argument that Chris has tonight would be teleological evil. That's the one that keeps me up at night, if I'm being completely honest. So great job bringing that up and giving me something to think on.
Yeah, teleological evil, for sure, I believe is the strongest objection to theism. Although I believe all the piece of evidence I provided had some weight, I believe that that's the one that's by far the strongest. I actually tweeted that teleological evil is the closest thing to a knockdown objection to theism that there is. It's not a knockdown, but it's the closest thing naturalists are going to get.
And then I don't know if Salem was asking this, but do you want to do the converse then? What do you think is the strongest support for theism or against atheism?
Yeah. In terms of evidentialist arguments, I think if I had to just give one evidentialist argument tonight, I would give the argument from physical laws. That's inspired by, actually, it's pretty much a Swinburne's argument. I find that one the strongest evidential one. But in terms of like argument that's still most convincing to me, I find deductive modal contingency arguments to be strongest.
Yeah, I think moral agency and moral economy is the strongest argument for theism by far. And by moral economy, I mean not just moral agents, but moral agents that participate in a moral social system in which they make decisions that impact each other, and that there's an interconnected and very intricate web of moral agents or decisions and how they affect each other. And it's all interconnected and very, very complex, right? And I believe that this is like a teleological structure that's not expected under naturalism, but is expected under theism. So that's probably the thing that keeps me up at night the most in favor. Luckily, my opponents did not bring that up tonight. So,
well, thank you for giving me another argument to use next time.
It's over.
Sorry, I'm trying to find. Okay, so this is for youth resist. If the natural laws, physical constants are contingent, this seems like an explanatory advantage for theism. So would you say that naturalism would have to posit that natural laws are necessary?
Natural laws, at least. Okay, so the naturalist has different routes to go when it comes to natural laws. I can either hold that they are fundamental to certain substances and are grounded in substances' causal powers, or they can hold that they are descriptive ways of describing the way reality and nature functions. Right? These are all options open to the naturalist. So, right. So, if natural laws, physical are contingent, it seems like it. Right. So, assuming that natural laws are contingent, right, and they aren't necessitated either by essences, kinds, or by some other sort of necessity, and they are in fact contingent, which would rule out the teleology that I talked about. Assuming that's the case, that my argument for teleology is somehow shaved off and is proven to be erroneous, and we just had physical laws and teleology, then I feel like this would constitute evidence for theism, because this would get rid of the fallacy of understated evidence objection, because there simply is the evidence of physical laws that Chris has put forth. However, considering that that's not the case, and there is the understated evidence that I presented in my teleology slide, it's not the case, right, that physical laws and physical constants are contingent in the meaningful sense that would favor theism.
Okay, and I think they were also prefacing in a way they phrased it earlier about fine-tuning. So if the laws are contingent and then there's fine-tuning, then how would that factor in? Or if you're saying that the laws are necessary, how does that relate to fine tuning? I think was also what they were asking about.
Fine tuning is an interesting issue, but I am inclined to say that fine tuning does add a slight bit of credence towards theism, right? Because fine tuning is just the facts that certain physical constants are at a certain value, which is highly favorable towards life, right? And so I don't necessarily think that this plays into teleology as I've described, and so at least or it at least seems to provide some evidence towards theism. So I have no issue making that concession.
And then the Theist Thinker answered this earlier, but Youth Resist, who's your favorite philosopher?
That's a good question. I am tempted to say Schopenhauer, but I'd probably go with Augustine.
All right. And then I want to be careful with this. I don't want to bag on somebody, but I want to let them ask their questions. So maybe in a way that's charitable, maybe we could frame this instead of I'm knocking on somebody, like, is there a certain approach to debating or philosophy that you think should be avoided without, throwing somebody under the bus?
Scientism.
It's a good one. I was going to say that probably a poor methodology is constantly trying to pull shifting burdens of proof. I think that comes up a lot, but it's just not truth conducive. If someone's like, well, actually you have the burden of proof and I have, literally nothing to offer to defend my position. I think that coming to truth involves both people putting their best ideas out on the table and seeing which one comes out on top. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from with that.
All right, and then I'll do Relay Theology a favor, even though they came in late with this. What books would you guys recommend for and against your positions? And then this will be our last question.
Yeah, in the spirit of the evidentialist case that I've given tonight, for my position, I'm going to offer Richard Swinburne's The Existence of God. And against it, I'm going to present Graham Oppy's best argument against God, where he sort of lays out a conceptual landscape of theory comparison and then showing why God does not come out on top.
So I think the best case for theism is that's a good question. Probably some. I think the best argument for theism comes from Augustine or Dostoevsky. I'm very sympathetic to existential, experiential, romantic means of coming to knowledge from God and accepting God. Right, arguments for desire. That's my favorite arguments for theism. And if I were to become a theist, it would be because of that, right? And in terms of like analytic philosophy of religion, there are a lot of very intelligent theistic philosophers out there, but overall, I think that ultimately that kind of pales in comparison to the existential romantic case that can be made for theism. And on the atheist side, I'd say the best. That's a hard question, but I'd probably go with I honestly don't know what would be the best book in favor of atheism. I'm tilted to say I'm leaning towards dialogues on natural religion, Hume, Mackey's Miracle of Theism. Right, generally I think I like some of the strongest case, but of course both are a bit dated, so that would be my main issue with them at this point. But overall, still wonderful works. So yeah, that's my take on it.
All right, thanks for that, and hopefully I got all the questions, but I apologize if I missed somebody. Is there anything else you guys want to briefly close with or plug?
So can I add something that I said to like an earlier question, just like a brief addition? I just wanted to clarify like what I said about the big conjunctive fact, right? The set of all contingent facts, which is that I believe it to be true that when we're explaining a set, right? If we explain each member of the set, right? We have a set of three things. I have an explanation for 1, 2, and 3. Each of them is individually explained. I don't believe that there's any additional explanation needed for the set of these facts, right? And so that's just because I feel like I kind of waffled on that a bit. So to put like my objection as clear and direct as possible, when we explain each member of a set, we do not need to explain the set as a whole. There's nothing added that needs to be explained. So that's just all I wanted to add, because I thought I kind of fumbled on that, but I wanted to make clear my thoughts on that.
Theist Thinker, did you have anything else you want to close with?
I didn't have anything that I felt that I wasn't able to like address tonight, other than the fact that, you know, there's a lot of substance here, and, you know, some of it probably got brushed over, unfortunately. But again, I am looking forward to continuing this and further conversations with Chris. Again, we should never be afraid of the truth, and I am always looking forward to engaging in thoughtful dialogues and working towards coming to truth about the fundamental nature of our reality, which I think that, you know, this conversation helped push us towards. And so I wanted to again say thank you, Dry Apologist, and thank you, Chris, for having this discussion. This was fantastic, and thank you everyone who watched this. This was awesome. So thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, for sure. This was great. I really enjoyed dialoguing with you and bringing it back to the topic quote on my last slide. I believe that dialogues like this are what philosophy is about. Philosophy is a social endeavor, and talking to the best of the opposition is exactly how we get closer to reality. I thought this was a great example of this. Thank you, Dry Apologist, for having me on. Everybody who's contributed and watched this, it's great. And I can say that Chris definitely won this debate. No doubt. Chris crushed it. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
Right. Yeah, thanks for coming on, and thanks, audience, for tuning in and participating, and have a good rest.